Hello everyone. My task today is to read the final chapter of George's Marvellous Medicine to you. I really hope you've enjoyed this book. I told you at the beginning, in chapter 1, this is one of my favourite books, so I really hope you've all enjoyed it, listening to it on our YouTube channel. I'm in school today. I'm sat in my office, so I thought it'd be quite nice to finish our final chapter in school. So the final chapter today is Goodbye, Grandma. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be, George said. Give up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking away slowly. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and shouted, "What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I may be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs, no bacon, no buttered toast." "I'm sorry, Mother," Mrs. Cranky said. "We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away." "Let George get it, the lazy little brute," Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. "Ho ho!" she cried. "Ha ha! That's your little game, is it? You look after yourself, all right, don't you? You make sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think once to let your poor old grandma have one. I always knew you were a selfish pig." "No, Grandma," George said. "This isn't—" "Don't lie to me, boy," the enormous old hag shouted. "Pass it up here this minute." "No," cried Mrs. Cranky. "No, Mother, don't. That's not for you." "Now you're against me too," shouted Grandma. "My own daughter, trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out." Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid woman and smiled sweetly. "Of course it's for you, Grandma," he said. "You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot." "Don't you think I won't," Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup of tea. "Hand it over, George." "No, no, Grandma," George cried out, pulling the cup away. "You mustn't. You're not to have it." "Give it to me, boy," yelled Grandma. "Don't," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's George's Marvellous." "Everything's George around here," shouted Grandma. "George this, George that. I'm fed up with it." She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it right up out of reach. "Drink it up, Grandma," Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. "Lovely tea." "No," cried the other two. "No, no." But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she'd swallowed everything that was in it. "Mother," wailed Mrs. Cranky, "you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4. And look what that tiny spoonful did to that little brown hen." But Grandma didn't even hear. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. "This is going to be interesting," Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. "Now you've done it." Glaring at her husband, Mrs. Cranky said, "You've cooked the old girl's goose." "I didn't do anything," Mr. Cranky said. "Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it." A tremendous hissing sound was coming from their heads, above their heads. The steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. "She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam," Mr. Cranky said. "She's gonna blow up," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "Her boiler's going to burst." Stand clear, said Mr. Cranky. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag, and she was whistling so high and shrill that it hurt his ears. "Call the fire department!" shouted Mrs. Cranky. "Call the police! Man the hoses!" "Too late," Mr. Cranky said, looking pleased. "Grandma," shrieked Mrs. Cranky. "Mother! Run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She'd started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down really fast. "Watch this, George," Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. Watch what happens when someone had 50 spoonfuls instead of one. Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" cried Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face still bore that foul and furious expression that it always had. Her eyes, no bigger than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you've been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?" "She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She's still getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller still?" "You can't," Mr. Cranky said. "She had 50 times the right amount." "I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as she is." Catch a hold of each end and pull. But by then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, and then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. I've lost her." "Hooray!" shouted Mr. Cranky. "She's gone. She's disappeared completely." cried Mrs. Cranky. "Well, that's what happens if you're a grumpy, bad-tempered old goat," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, that, George." George didn't really know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime, she was saying, "Oh well, I suppose it's for the best." Really, she was a bit of a nuisance round the house, wasn't she? "Yes," Mr. Cranky said, "she most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments he had touched, with the very tips of his fingers, the edge of the magic world. So, the old granny got what she deserved. But don't go making any medicine, anyone. It's a very special book. It's a very special story by Roald Dahl. I really hope you've all enjoyed it. And I really hope to see you all very soon. And keep safe. Keep well. Keep an eye on the YouTube channel for anything new that we post. Keep on Google Classrooms. If you're not on it yet, look at our website on your class pages. There's loads of information there. But generally, hope you've really enjoyed the book. See you very soon. Keep reading. Find some more Roald Dahl books because they're excellent. Okay, everyone. See you soon. Bye now.